Welcome, everybody. Hello, how are you? Welcome to our professional development session today, Understanding Genocide, Teaching the 10 Stages of Genocide, featuring Dr. Charlotte Decoster. And we're really so happy that you're here with us today. We are joined by a number of guests, and so we're going to say a few words leading up here to build up to the session. We're recording the session in case you know of anybody as well who was hoping or intending to come but couldn't make it today, and so we'll be able to share that on a limited basis for purposes of copyright and whatnot. But without further ado, so that we can get our program moving here today, I'd first like to introduce to you. I'm happy to say that increasingly we here at the Holocaust Center in Seattle, we're seeking to make meaningful partnerships, and where else better to start than with our own friends here in the Northwest, the Pacific Northwest here. South of us in Oregon, and just slightly east of us, I guess, with Idaho. And so first guest I'd like to introduce you to is Elena Hune, and she is of the Wasmuth Center for Human Rights in Idaho. So Elena.
Yeah, welcome everyone. As Paul said, I am representing the Wasmuth Center for Human Rights in Boise, Idaho. We're thrilled to be part of this program and this valuable resource. And I received a little shout out on the graphic novels that you'll learn about. They're incredible. We look forward to learning more with you tonight.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate it, Elena. And now my friend and partner, Amanda Colvin from the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education in Portland, Oregon.
Thanks for nailing the whole name, Paul. Really appreciate it.
Practice.
So I just wanted to drop I wanted to drop a link in the chat for everybody. This is just a really handy list of all the different types of resources and learning opportunities that we offer at the museum. So I'm not going to go through them all, but we do have a resource guide that covers lots of different lessons, videos, podcasts, just different types of resources. And then our online experiences, you can hear directly from 18 Holocaust survivors. We took video clips and audio testimony, and it's really interactive in a way that you can use it with your students. So if you have any questions, you can always email me, but I so look forward to this session, Charlotte. I've been wanting to do this for a year, so really excited that we can make this happen with everyone.
Okay, great.
Awesome. Thank you, Amanda. And now it's my pleasure to introduce to you Nancy Powell and her sister Carol. They have for years supported Holocaust education throughout the state of Washington and beyond, so much with their generous support and just really investing in what it means for teachers, and always talking to us and brainstorming ways that we can better connect the lessons to be learned from the Holocaust and apply them to today, as you can see we so sorely need. And so, Nancy, it's my pleasure to ask you to say some words to our guests.
Hi, everyone. Hi, teachers and Pal Fellows that have been through some of our learning sessions at the Holocaust Center. I appreciate everybody who has signed up and is going to participate today. I know a lot of you know something about Carol and I, but for those that don't, I just want to do a little introduction. And I want to thank Charlotte for speaking today, and thank you, Paul, Alana, Richard, and Elena for making this seminar possible. My sister Carol and I have been supporting Holocaust education for 15 years through seminars, lectures, and curriculum development. Our family history includes Carol's mother-in-law, Georgette Heller, who is an Auschwitz survivor. She is celebrating her 95th birthday this month. And our grandfather, Solomon Powell, who escaped pogroms in the Ukraine to come to America in the early 1900s. Our goal is to educate as many teachers as we can about the Holocaust, to have the history of the Holocaust and other genocides taught in classrooms throughout the world. Through this teaching, we hope to build a more tolerant society for those diverse communities that we have. It is important for you to participate in the seminar today. This will create the best learning experience possible for everybody. Please pass on what you learned to other teachers. Students will then pass on the information to their families and communities, and I know you can make a difference. So thank you from Carol and I.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nancy.
Thank you.
So at the Holocaust Center here in Seattle, we have several upcoming events and things. So I just wanted to like sort of promote a couple of them. One is on April 28th at 7 p.m. is our annual Yom HaShoah program. And this will feature true stories from a panel of survivors, some that are well known to our community, but this is an incredible opportunity to see these survivors speak and address questions amongst one another. Another big forthcoming event is on May 19th. Many of you have perhaps heard about or even read the book People Love Dead Jews by Dara Horn. And she is going to be a guest here in Seattle at the Temple de Hirsch Sinai. And that will be on May 19th at 7 p.m. And that will be both an in-person and hybrid event. And so we are going to make that available, accessible as well for teachers to get clock hours. And so whether you need to register for that. And so one thing, if none of our other guests have already mentioned it, we were able to put all of our things onto one common document. So don't worry about scanning through chat, saying, oh my gosh, where's the Oregon one or where's the Idaho one? We put the Dallas information relative to today's session and things you'll see and learn about together with things that each of our respective centers are, take a look. So click things and you can sign up or explore. We're all friends here, so it's all great. So I'll drop that in there, and that's where you can see about registering for either of those events as well. Then the other one thing I wanted to say before segueing in is that as I said, Amanda Coven of the Oregon Museum and I, we've been brainstorming a lot together and working on things. And one of these things in our partnership is that we are working collaboratively to expand our respective speakers bureaus to include speakers of other genocides. And so most recently, perhaps some of you saw 2 weeks ago, we had worked hard to create the opportunity for Emmanuel Turaturanye, a survivor of the Rwandan genocide, and he spoke at a lunch and learn that over 140 people attended, and it was just tremendously highly praised and reviewed. This is an incredible opportunity, and he is now available to begin speaking in high school classrooms and things. And so among the links that you'll see, you can click our Speakers Bureau. And for those of you that are interested in perhaps expanding what your students see and learn about in addition to stories relative to the Holocaust, Emmanuel is an incredible story. He lost over 100 members of his family, and why he's teaching it is really one of the most heartfelt and inspiring things that I've heard anyone say before. So it's really an incredible thing. And then last, today's presentation, obviously, as we know, is just almost too timely. Not only is April Genocide Awareness Month, but to watch the news over the past many weeks, and particularly scenes that we saw this weekend in the town of Bucha in Ukraine, has disturbed, outraged, and rendered us to tears. I remember a passage in Elie Wiesel's memoir, Night, where he and so many other Jews could not believe that such atrocities as we are seeing could occur in the 20th century. And yet here we are in the 21st century, and the song remains the same, doesn't it? Dr. Gregory Stanton's 10 Stages of Genocide give us as educators a remarkable framework by which to analyze the horrors people have done, can, and continue to perpetrate. The hope is that one day we'll look at such things with both heart and head and make the phrase "never again" actually mean what it says. We're so grateful that Charlotte Decoster, the Ackerman family director of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, is here today to hopefully help us take a big necessary leap forward in our understanding of what is and the common steps that describe the stages of genocide in ways that your students will both learn and hopefully remember. Charlotte, an experienced educator, holds a PhD in history from the University of North Texas, and she regularly speaks on the Holocaust, children, and child rescue during the Holocaust and in Nazi Germany. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce and to welcome Charlotte to join our Pacific Northwest crowd. Charlotte?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. I'm joining here from a very sunny, sun going down here, Dallas, Texas. As a I apologize if I have a little 7-year-old. She's about to go to bed here in a little bit. It's come running by just in advance. But I also want to start off with thanking all the museums and centers that invited me to come speak. Paul and Amanda and Elena for inviting me. It is just such a wonderful opportunity when, as museum educators, we get to support each other and work together. And I've learned just so much from them as well through this journey too. I also want to thank Nancy and Carol for their continued support. Families like that and supporters like that make education like this possible, not only in your region, but here in Texas too. And we as museums and centers really rely on those people so much to make this possible. So I wanted to give them a big thank you as well. I'm going to share my PowerPoint. I am not the best at tech, so I apologize already for that in advance too. My many apologies as we go. I hope y'all are able to kind of see my intro slide here. Some of you can give me a nod. Yes, yeah, great, thank you. I also want to let you know I'm pretty informal, so if you have any questions, I'll be following the chat. You can unmute and interrupt me at any time. Please feel free. This is a very complex topic with many questions and sometimes complex answers to it as well. So please feel free to bring your questions up. I might not be able to answer all of them. If not, I can do some research and get answers back to you. You might get answers in a week that you wake up the middle of the night and think of a question. So I'll leave my email too if you have those questions much later. And I think in the Google Doc that Paul shared, there'd be some contact for your local centers and museums too. So I always recommend in a PD like this, see us as a resource too. I think that's number one, besides all the resources that we shared today too. What I wanted to start with is, come on, is some teaching guidelines first when teaching this topic of genocide. And I think these are things that we probably do as educators and think about, but it's just good to remember this, especially with such a complex topic as genocide. And I wanted to let you know that as museum educators, we adhere to this pretty closely as well. And it, is always when we think of teaching a subject like this, be it in a classroom, be it at a museum, building an exhibit. When we built our museum, which opened in 2019, we had to think about these teaching guidelines as well. And also, how would we approach teaching the history of genocide, which is so big, right? It's such a big topic. How do you address that? And so we thought about it for a very long time and came up with this concept of looking at the process of genocide rather than each individual genocide, because we kind of had this idea, if we go address the history of every genocide, we might as well build 10 more museums, unfortunately. This concept of never again, unfortunately, we have not reached that point yet. So we keep on building on this history as, the last few months, not just in the Ukraine, but in several areas of the world, it's been very obvious. And so this is why we centered everything around the concept of the 10 stages of genocide and really exploring the concept and the process of genocide rather than each individual genocide. And I think that really fit in within those teaching guidelines is when we teach genocide studies, it doesn't matter if it fits within world history in a US history class, or if you're teaching a genocide studies special topics course, or if I'm standing in the exhibit, it sometimes is better to look at the process rather than every single genocide, because it leads us into some traps. And so this is why it's important to keep those guidelines in place. So I wanted to cover those really quick first. First is define the term genocide. And I think that's really important. Even us as a museum, we struggle with that. Is what exactly do we use? At the museum, we actually use the legal definition of genocide by the United Nations, and I will show you that in a little bit. But there's many different ways to approach that definition of genocide. Maybe your local center might have a a definition separate from the United Nations. You can look at the United States Holocaust Museum, which breaks down in the levels all the way from mass killings to mass atrocities to genocides, all the different levels that are segmented out within that legal definition of genocide. So there's so many ways to approach it, but it is really important when you're teaching on this concept, you need to set some kind of standard, some expectation of what genocide is, and kind of spend some time breaking that down before you even get to actually discussing the process. And in that second guideline, right, this is why we're here today, is rather investigate the process and the context of genocide than looking at every single genocide and fall potentially into that trap, which is that next teaching guideline of creating very simplistic parallels. I call this the compare and contrast trap. We have to be careful with that. Every genocide is unique. Genocide never happens the same way. And so we got to be very careful with oversimplifying this concept of genocide and oversimplifying the different genocides by comparing and contrasting them. And so rather looking at the whole process and seeing markers within that process of genocide and seeing how that appears in each genocide is a much more methodological sound approach than lining up all genocides and see how they compare and contrast, because we can really fall into some other very dangerous oversimplification and also misconceptions with that when we compare and contrast. And then I think the last two ones are really, I wanted to give those two because they are part of our teaching guidelines. We won't address them as much today, but looking at responses to genocide is really important, right? How is in that process, when do responses happen? How does different communities from your local community back home to the global community respond to things, to people on the scene right there, are really important to analyze. And then finally, we call this the concept of upstanders. This teaching guideline really changes from museum to museum. Upstander is a big mission that part of our mission, but it's these positive role models, people who speak up, act up. When they see something wrong, they try to make a difference. They try to make it right. And so looking at those upstanders who drive that change is really important too. Is not, genocide is such a dark history, whatever genocide we look at, and looking at some of those positive role models that guide us along that way. So I wanted to check if there's any questions on these teaching guidelines, and these are just the broad ones. You can get much more deeper into these guidelines too, but just wanted to check if there's any questions on them so far.
So Charlotte, a couple of people have already asked me about if the PowerPoint is available, and I indicated that for copyright purposes, it's not, but I guess I wonder as a follow-up, are these explanations in the way that you're laying them out, are they like in a place that is accessible to educators?
Yes, so I will be showing where you can get the teaching guidelines here in a little bit, and they link up with the classroom and lessons too. And part of this PowerPoint, not everything, so several pieces are part of the lesson that I'm going to be sharing today too. I just can't share it as a one cohesive part due to copyright issues and all kinds of other things that come with presenting on genocide and conversations that we might have today too. So the lesson that I will share and how you can request that will have many of the slides here today. Thank you for asking that. That's a great question.
I think other than that, we're okay right now.
Great. So the first part of what I want to talk about is the formation of the concept of genocide, looking at the definition, and then actually looking at the 10 stages. So I kind of want to do this short little lecture first and then go into resources and classroom lessons. Now, because I'm going to go into our understanding genocide lesson after I've gone kind of through the presentation, I'm going to share you one of our worksheets already, and I'm oh, no, not yet. Go back. Clicking the wrong thing here. apologize. So I'm sharing now a Google Drive link, and you don't have to do this, but this is when I, in a little bit, will review the lesson. I will say this is kind of the sheet we will, that the students will look at. So if you want to open this, again, you don't have to, but if you kind of want to have it open next to you, you are welcome to open that up and have that kind of to follow along with. I'm also going to share one other resource. I normally, you have to request them to the lesson. So there are two just little components from the lesson, which I'll show you how to request that in a little bit. And that's in the big main Google Drive worksheet as well. But these are just two components that I'm sharing with you just separately, just for today, so that you can kind of follow along by the time we get to the lesson 2, that you kind of have already kind of gone, just like the students, through the process as well, because part of the lesson is looking at this PowerPoint, talking about the process. And I'll show you 2 ways how you can do that, and filling out this graphic organizer, which actually looks at the 10 stages of genocide through the lens of the Holocaust first. So, so you are welcome to keep that open, and I'll let you know once you can kind of start following along with that graphic organizer as well. But the beginning part, I always say, is key, is before you even start about the 10 stages of genocide, is kind of lay the framework of how genocide comes to be, because it's a very modern concept. It's, you know, we are very familiar with that. I bet if you're teaching high school or upper middle school, most of your students have at least heard of the word. They might not be able to define it or describe it, but they've probably heard of the word. It's pretty common to through our vocabulary by the time most students get to 8th, 9th grade. But they don't understand that this is very new. When we look at the early 1900s, this term really doesn't exist yet. There's vague descriptions of it, but the term actually isn't fully used yet. And when I talk about description, this is in upper levels of academia, a little bit some of the upper levels of what I call higher intellectual journalism, that we see investigations into what today we consider genocide or mass atrocity. And that starts with the Armenian genocide, really looking at what the Ottomans are doing. And strangely enough, that most of that exploration is happening within Germany, kind of Austrian academic world, and in Switzerland. That's where a lot of this investigation towards genocide is going to start. Not really a term around that yet. One of these academics is going to be, later is going to be coining the actual term genocide. Then after the Armenian genocide, we really have the next genocide really closely up. And I always like to talk about this one because it's kind of almost, I feel like the forgotten genocide in the world. It's the Holodomor, which is really relevant today because it's the genocide that the Soviet Union commits against the Ukraine to really squish Ukrainian nationalism. With that, it pulls all grain out of the Ukraine with the intent to eliminate the in part of Ukrainian society that is trying to find a Ukrainian national identity. And it will murder millions. And again, in the journalistic world, in the academic world, people are writing about it, but it's not huge. It's not in the forefront yet. And then we get to World War II and the Holocaust, right? And now there's no turning back anymore. There's no denying. There's no looking away, right? And especially the United States, but even the Soviet Union makes sure that we can't look away anymore, right? Evidence is everywhere. Films are being made. And now we have trials for the first time in 1945, where people are put on trial and with charges that impact civilians, crimes against humanity, not genocide yet. That's not going to happen yet at the International Military Tribunal and at the follow-up Nuremberg trials. But the descriptions start happening, and the term is going to get used already. Not as a charge yet, not as a crime, but it pops up in the notes of these trials, reflecting back on the Holocaust and especially World War II. And with that, legal definitions are starting to get formed of what genocide is. And with that, really, with the Holocaust, we see really the birth of the term genocide developing. Although the discussions start with Armenia, the term itself gets formed with the Holocaust. And then, of course, we have the United Nations being formed, which is really going to drive this forward, is this concept of what these crimes are and what that means in a legal international context. First, with working on the Declaration of Human Rights, in which these conversations starts, but then, of course, with the Genocide Convention in 1948. And with that, now we have a legal definition of what genocide is and how we will punish those who commit genocide. That does not take away genocide, of course. And this, I just have three right there, and that's just a drop in the bucket, right? We have Cambodia, we have Bosnia, we have the Rwanda genocide against the Tutsis, and we have Guatemala. We can add on and on and on and on there. Unfortunately, that continues. Myanmar, Syria, we can have these endless discussions past 1948. And so that is really important to understand is that this notion of genocide, this work of genocide awareness is very, very new. And we will look today at some genocides retroactively, right, before the concept. Among the Holodomor and Armenia are reflecting backwards, and we'll look at some other ones as well. And that's important to understand for your students, that some of the genocides that you might look at, you're looking back, in a sense, past when the concept is being, before the concept is being formed, and that is important. So I'm seeing Katie ask here, has the definition of genocide changed early to more modern history? So the definition, in the 1910s and 1920s, the concept is very vaguely described, and it is probably what today we consider more the definition of mass atrocity. Of course, today, genocide is by the United Nations legally defined, and we'll look at that definition and the complexity and the issues with that definition. It's not so easy, and this is why we have whole debates on what is genocide and what is not genocide, and why we'll look at the 10 stages instead today with that too. Yeah, we will look here at Raphael Lemkin. Is definitely interwoven with that. He's going to be one of those academics, and he's eventually going to coin that term too. But do be aware, he does not coin that term until we get really 44, 45 in reference with the trials. That's when he actually starts coining that term, although he's one of those academics that is toying and with the concept already with the Armenian genocide. And he will look at the Holodomor as well. So that definition, right, 1948, and here we have Mr. Lemkin, who's eventually going to actually coin the term genocide, and he is going to be one of the drafters of the Genocide Convention, really working on the definition part itself. With a concept of a legal scholar behind him and understanding a victim himself of the Holocaust too, and losing a lot of family. He comes from two very different perspectives to this concept of genocide and the definition with it as well. But he's not alone in drafting this. It does take a whole committee. And this is a very, very short version of what this lengthy document of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide is, aka known as the Genocide Convention. But the most important parts of this is, of this definition in genocide and the convention, is any of the following acts committed with the intent. And this is where I always stop, is intent is a very key part in genocide. Is there has to be an intent. So it needs to be on purpose to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, religious group as in such. By the way, you'll notice not all identity groups are in this definition, and that is really important. And is what some consider some of the failures of the convention as well, that not all identity groups are in this. Yes, somebody pointed out, how do Indigenous people fall into this? On purpose, Indigenous identities and how they would fit into this are on purpose for many leading nations were left out of the convention, so that retroactively the Genocide Convention couldn't be used against a nation with that, as well. As you can just see how Britain and the United States and Russia and many other nations would potentially be liable signing this document as well in the International Criminal Court. But it is killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and or forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. And this is where we see Indigenous people fall into this category as well, especially if they are defined as a national group. And this is where within the convention, that what specifically is a national group. This is also, by the way, the conversation that is going on about the Ukraine today as well, in which category of identity this would fall, and Ukraine would very likely fall under national identity group with that too. So somebody asked, does it need to be sponsored by a ruling government? No, but it doesn't have to be necessarily a government, but it has to be a power structure in place. And that is really important as well, especially when we look at Bosnia, because some of the eventually people who are charged with genocide were not necessarily part of government structures, and that is important to understand as well. Too. So in this definition, you know, the Genocide Convention has this big part in it, prevention, but the weakness with the Genocide Convention is that until you commit genocide, the convention actually doesn't kick in. Think about that, right? It is actually a weakness of the convention right there, is that the prevention part is that it defines, and the punishment is the prevention, right? And if you know anything about criminal justice, we know that most of the time, punishment is not necessarily a tool of prevention of a crime. I'm getting a lot of sound from somebody. Yeah, thank you. And let me know if you have a question, if I'm hearing sound, not well as a question coming through. We know that this punishment of the crime is actually not really a prevention tool, because otherwise we wouldn't have the lineup of genocides that we have. And so other tools need to be created to create the prevention part. And this is where the 10 stages really come in. They are an educational and an awareness model. And this all came about in the 1990s, when the world started a little more becoming aware that the Genocide Convention wasn't going to just cut it. More was needed. And especially in the academic world, a lot of research was being done in the 90s, creating methods of awareness. And the 10 stages is just one of these models that came out. There's many other professors. Dr. Israel Charney created a model as well. We at the museum use the 10 stages of genocide, developed by Dr. Gregory Stanton from George Mason University. And this is a model that we use at the museum, but many of the state departments use this. Actually, at levels of the United Nations, this model is now being used as well. But do be aware there's other models of genocide awareness out there as well. Our colleagues at the national level at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, for example, use a different model, more based on Dr. Charney's model as well. But all of these models that arise in the 90s become more awareness models. For us not to understand what happened during the genocide, but how do we get to that point of what we legally call genocide? What else happens before that? And what is the full process? And that's what the 10 stages of genocide does. And by the way, Dr. Stanton, besides creating the model of the 10 stages, also created an organization called Genocide Watch, and the Genocide Alliance was born out of that as well, with all different organizations that work towards that genocide awareness as well. So if you want to explore more about what Dr. Stanton does and the resources that come with the 10 stages from his perspective, I do have to say they're at very high level, but there's some really cool time strands, I don't know what they call them again, available as well, and very academic articles about the 10 stages too, if you want to delve in that too. After this, and I believe I have that linked in your Google document as well, with all of the resources that Paul, Amanda, and Elena provided for you. So I'm going to introduce this process first, the whole process, and then go through the 10 stages. Again, if there's questions coming in the meanwhile, or anything that you want to share or that doesn't make sense, please let me know. The 10 stages of genocide. The first important thing is to share with your students that genocide is very complex and it never happens the same way. I don't know how many times I can stress this to you, and you should stress to your students, is there is, you know, the Holocaust is different from Cambodia, from Rwanda, from Ukraine today. Actually, the Ukraine today and the Holodomor are going to be very, very different in that sense as well. Yeah, somebody, sorry, I'm seeing the chat here too, some people mentioning some other processes as well. But when we look at each genocide, we do notice that there's certain markers that always happen. Now, these markers are what Dr. Stanton calls stages. They don't always happen in the same order. And that is really important to understand. So number one, understanding the 10 stages of genocide is that they are not linear. They can happen in any order, but they are predictable. And with that, we usually see earlier stages happening earlier, and then later stages happening later. Give me just 1 second. I apologize. I told you my 7-year-old at some point was going to interrupt me, so I apologize. Sorry. I knew that was going to happen. I apologize. We know that the earlier stages that we're going to see usually come earlier, but they don't necessarily go away. Also, we're going to see one of the last stages is going to be denial. Quite frequently starts happening already, and then kind of ebbs and goes away. And this makes, again, the process of genocide very complex, because there is no straight, nice pattern, right? Which we all love. We all like very cool, nice, clean models, right? And that is something that the 10 stages of genocide is not going to provide you. The way I always explain it to students is, interesting enough, I used this explanation way before COVID, but somehow COVID made it a little bit more understandable, is that this process of genocide is almost kind of like a really bad virus or a really bad illness. I used to use the flu for it, but you wake up in the morning and you just know that something's not right. You can't really pinpoint what it is, right? But you know about it, your body, right? You know your body, something is not right. And then we kind of start puzzling and feeling, oh, maybe I have a headache, I have this, and you might take some aspirin or something and it takes it back away, but then it comes back a little bit stronger and other symptoms start appearing and you take maybe something else, but you can still go into work and maybe share it with others, and then you get home and you feel even worse and you say, I don't have to go to the doctor yet, right? There's still more time and you push it off, but you go to bed early because you think if I have a good night's sleep it will be gone again the next day, and so you kind of patch it up, and then in the middle of the night you wake up and at a certain point you hit that fever point where there's no going back, there's no return anymore. And you have this kind of ebb and flow and very kind of weird process. And in a sense, that's how genocide works as well. And that's what the 10 stages try to explain as well. A lot of times those stages also come in pairs of 2 and they align itself. And here in Texas, we wonderfully call that the Texas 2-step. Everything has to be Texas related here. But it actually does work. We always have these 2 and 2 going together with that. So I'll point that out as I'll go through the stages. Okay, I'm going to go through the stages. I'm going to go a little bit quicker through them, but you should, if you want to follow along too, you should have the stages through the Holocaust, and you can also follow them along on the little handout that I shared to the Google Drive as well. If not, I have them listed out on my PowerPoint too. If you have questions, please stop me, put them in the chat. But first, before we move on, I want to check if there's any questions about the actual 10 stages process and model. All good? Yeah, and somebody put in there Shoah versus Holocaust. That's really an interesting concept too. Katie, I'll give you my email. Maybe too much to go in depth here for this training today, but we actually use the term Shoah, Holocaust for our exhibition wing. So if you want to go into that discussion, I can definitely guide you on that too. Okay, stage 1, classification. And I know I say stage 1, but remember, they're not really in any particular order. But these are classification and symbolization are definitely the earlier stages. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide you the definition. You can read them here as well and give 2 quick examples. I'm always going to give an example from the Holocaust. That is, if you're teaching earlier grades, 6th, 7th, I recommend looking at the model of the 10 stages through one genocide. Pick whichever one you want to do. The Holocaust, of course, you're going to find the most resources with. That is just because there's just so much more available on there, and also the magnitude of the Holocaust. But you can pick any of these genocides that I picked today, or pick your other one. If you go to higher rate levels, you can mix them up. And that's what we do at the museum. We actually pick a genocide, for historical genocide, for each one of these stages to look at. So that's however you want to teach it, but I'll give examples of both. So classifications, all cultures have to distinguish between us and them by ethnicity, race, religion, or nationality. By the way, we use a much longer definition too. We actually worked on Dr. Stanton with that. This is a very short version because you can look at many more identities beyond legal definition of the United Nations when it comes to that classification. Also, what is important is that these earlier stages of classification and symbolization are necessary in the process of genocide, but definitely don't have to lead to genocide. They frequently just exist in our society. It's really when they're used for hateful purposes that we can have to become aware that we might be now on the path in the process of going towards legal genocide, which will be extermination. During the Holocaust, let me give you an example, right? This classification is something that usually exists in society, right? I like to give Wagner's opera, the Ring der Nibelungen. It's this famous opera. Actually, once in a while, the Dallas Opera loves to play it as well, which creeps me out a little bit. But it's this opera between the Aryan supreme gods, who are these beautiful, pure creatures, and the evil trolls who want to take down these supreme gods. And it's basically this ultimate battle between the races, the gods being the Aryans, the Germanic race, and the trolls, these evil undergroundlings who are battling. And they are the Jews. Wagner was openly anti-Semitic, wrote treatises about it, and many of his music centered around that. And this just shows, right? This isn't culture. This classification of us versus them is just in music, right? Was so integrated in European culture. It's so part of that you know, somebody like a Wagner is just openly making music about that. In the Guatemala genocide, when Mayans were portrayed as these rebellious warriors. And this comes all the way from early European colonization, when they were met actually with a very sizable Mayan army, which we usually don't think about when we think about European colonization. We don't usually talk about Mayan armies, but this was the case. And this is actually a statue of Tekon Unam, who's usually portrayed as this ultimate, like, super muscle man warrior with these animal heads and everything. We actually are pretty sure that that's not what Tekon Unam looked like, but it is this concept that the Mayan is this uncivilized, rebellious warrior, and that classification exists already from early colonization of Guatemala, and remains in that view, continues throughout, and of course is going to have really big an impact on the Guatemala genocide. Symbolization. Now, when we have this classification, it is really important that the perpetrator group now assigns some kind of symbol. This can be a symbol that we already have, or that is given to a certain group. Here are two examples of given symbols, in a sense. The yellow star during the Holocaust, and then on top, the blue chroma, which was given to Vietnamese or who were considered citizens in Cambodia who were considered ethnically Vietnamese. They were forced to wear this blue chroma to really target them, whereas the Pol Pot regime wore the red chroma. But another symbol that I want to point out, which is not a given symbol, but a symbol that already existed during the Cambodia genocide, is eyeglasses. Eyeglasses were a symbol of somebody who could read, who was part of an intellectual society, not a peasant society. And since they were the target during the Cambodia genocide, the fact that you were wearing eyeglasses became a symbol as well. Now, again, symbolization exists in society, right? I now have to be careful here because I'm not in Texas, but I usually give the example of the Dallas Cowboys, right? Classification, right? I cannot be part of the Dallas Cowboys. I can be part of the fan base, right? I have a very strong Cowboy supporter here. I apologize for all the other fans out there. He wears that star with pride, right? And that symbolization. That is not symbolization and classification on the path towards genocide, right? My husband is not going to murder out Seahawk fans tomorrow, or his best buddy is a Seahawks fan, and we allow that Seahawk in the house too. But it is now, if we now start using that for hateful purposes, not allowing Seahawks fans in the house, that's when we might potentially be on the path towards genocide. So I want to make sure that that is clear. Everybody kind of got those two first stages? Somebody said, would all stages need to be met for genocide to occur? Absolutely. For the process of genocide to be complete, all 10 stages need to occur. That's when we officially have genocide. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't stop it from happening, right? The whole point about the 10 stages is that we don't get to all the 10 stages, right? That we should recognize that we're on the path, that the process has been enacted, that we don't get to some of those latter stages that we will cover. That's the whole intent about it. Yes, please. Somebody said that they turned their camera off. Please, you're welcome to turn it off too. Okay, just making sure I didn't miss anything in the chat. Okay, the next two are discrimination, is when actual laws, customs, and political power are used to deny the human rights and civil rights of a group. Particularly, we see citizenship rights, because, you know, citizenship, you remove citizenship from somebody, you remove everything, right? So during the Holocaust, obviously, right, the Nuremberg laws puts you on that path. They remove from Jews citizenship. They define who Jews are and then remove their citizenship. And with that, you lose all of your civil rights with that. So that is kind of a clear indicator of discrimination, but sometimes it's not always, this stage is not as clear, because it can be social or custom. There doesn't necessarily need to be a law in place to discriminate. For example, the genocide in Bosnia is the right of freedom of movement by the UN creating these safe zones, and then the Serbs militias creating basically sieges around these safe zones and not allowing anything in and out. It removes your ability of free movement. One of our basic human rights, and this is why it's important to also teach about human rights in genocide at the same time, because you can't talk about one without the other, because of this stage of discrimination. This is really where you need to make sure that you talk about that discrimination doesn't necessarily need to be legal discrimination. It can be social and political as well. Yes, I'm going to get to persecution here in a little bit. By the way, these are stages, and I want to be very careful. This is not the adjective of verb of discriminating. This is the stage of discrimination, which are two different things. Thank you, Amanda, for pointing that out too. These are the definitions of the stages set by Stanton. You know, discriminating can be used in many other ways as well, but discrimination, the stage as well, when that occurs in the process of genocide, is that removal. And we're going to talk what the difference is between stage of discrimination and persecution here in a little bit. Dehumanization is where we start denying the humanity, right, of that group. And that is really important. Again, not to be confused with dehumanizing, right? A victim can feel like they are being dehumanized. The stage of this dehumanization is when the group in power removes or use words to remove the humanity of the victim group to make it easier to murder that group. It is with no regard towards the feelings of the victim group. It is actually the feelings of the perpetrator group, making it easier to murder them. So here you see the cover of The Poisonous Mushroom, which is a children's book that, you know, taught little German and European kids, you know, not only is the Jew dangerous and poisonous, but look at all the little Jewlings in the back. Even the children, right? They're poisonous and dangerous too. We actually cover genocidal terror, and I have Osama bin Laden here, because in genocidal terror, especially when extremist groups use terror as a means of towards genocide, we use that word, hear that word traitor, enemy, infidel. By the way, Jews were blamed of traitor and enemy too, not necessarily do you need to be equated to an animal, right? Dehumanizing can also be something other, something else, devil-like, evil-like, enemy-like. And we see that in the Holocaust, but we see that especially in genocidal terror, social media is used quite frequently, that concept is being used as well. organization, again, not organizing, but the stage of organization, is when the power structure in place, the state, usually mainly in this case, the government, starts creating structures that will eventually implement the genocide. The earlier plans are being made, but not really specific plans, more like, hey, if we're gonna really go into murder out this group, we don't want to be in charge of this, right? It needs to be somebody else who eventually will be blamed for that. A bureaucracy, some other group. Right here, that photo on top is actually initiation for the SS, and you can see this is actually being done at a convent. So you can see all the nuns lined up at first, and then the nice SS initiation at the convent right behind it. With it as well. The image below it is actually from a propaganda poster from the Great Leap Forward in China, where Mao created this massive bureaucracy who then was in charge of implementing is removing grain, removing tools and steel in this effort of industrialization, knowing really well that when that structure was in place and they would implement that, millions of people would be murdered. And so sometimes those structures are very set in place, like an SS, Interhamwe in the Rwanda genocide. And sometimes it's much broader, like we see in the Great Leap Forward. Polarization is the dividing of the society. And by the way, this overlaps quite frequently with that stage of discrimination as well. But here now it is the moderates, those who might speak up and say something that are really being targeted, and saying, if you are not with us, you might as well be on the other side, right? We must, silence you. Intermarriage, a lot of different groups are being part. This is where the propaganda machine goes into crazy overdrive. It's not the start of the propaganda, but it's the overdrive. In Rwanda, we see, in the Rwanda genocide against the Tutsis, we see the creation of the Hutu 10 Commandments, which forbid interactions between Hutus and Tutsis, and that is continuously being read on the radio. Also, that now blends with dehumanization, right? Because on the radio, Tutsis are being called traitors, enemies, cockroaches, dangerous, stay away from them. Again, it's that polarization, right? If you are going to help a Tutsi, you might as well be Tutsi. During the Holocaust, signs, just the simple fact of putting signs everywhere that says, hey, Jews are not wanted here, don't sit on that bench, is that polarization, right? It just keeps the moderate silenced, and if it's not kind of that concept of it's not happening to you, just stay away from it, with that too. Preparation is when the planning stage, I call this the planning stage. Now we start drafting plans. We get nice little charts popping up. And the propaganda is going to start announcing the plan as well, that this is going to happen, usually disguised as self-defense. So if you start hearing the self-defense plan happening and leaders are starting to announce it, it's not just coming from the media, but the leaders who will be overseeing the genocide, when they start claiming self-defense, that's a really, really big sign that we are going to get close to what will become the legal definition of genocide. Remember, this is all still part of the wider process, right? But legally, in all of this, we have still not gotten to genocide. So things can be like ghettoization fall under this, right? Is bringing Jews during the Holocaust in these central places. So when deportations start happening, actually drafting of plans during the Holocaust as well. Some see the Wannsee Conference as an example of that too, but we have other ones like the Golopnik notes as well, where we know that plans are being drafted for the actual extermination of the Jews. days. During the Holodomor, we in the Ukraine, one of the genocides that we look at in the museum, we can see Stalin actually sitting down and setting these grain quotas, and you know, the Soviet regime nicely communicating, okay, that much grain is going to be taken. This is going to be the levels of starvation. This is going to be the rebellion against that. So this is the numbers that we need to get rid of. These are the numbers that we need to imprison, and these are the numbers that will die in the Ukraine, and let's go do it. And that is really important to understand with it too. Sometimes the numbers of murders are set by how much food you remove from a certain area as well. The means of genocide can be an actual physical weapon, but it also can be removal of basic necessities from human beings. That stage of persecution. Persecution is where I call the testing phase, this testing stage, where the perpetrator starts seeing how far can we really go. You know, this can happen, and then for years, we will go back down to the stage of discrimination, and then it will pop back up again. A great genocide like that is the Rwanda genocide against the Tutsis. We look at 1994 for that genocide. But really, if you look at the full process of genocide, it starts in the 1960s, but mass killings happening in 63 and 64. But we rarely look or talk about that. We talk about 94. Why? Because the numbers are just not big enough for the whole world to pay attention to. It's not approaching the hundreds of thousands. It's just more than a few thousand, and the world doesn't really look on yet. And that's really what during this stage happens. We see those killings, we see the sexual violence really picking up. And that's really important to understand with that as well, too. I'm going to browse through this really quick and then get to the questions here. Oh, sorry. I wanted this image. You can see that the Einsatzgruppe during the Holocaust is really clearly an example of this structure that goes out and starts killing. But we can already look before that as the testing of gas vans in certain areas is a clear example. Even the T4 program, which kind of gets shut down again quietly and has to go underground because that's, you know, nobody wants that in the public, and the Nazis realized that. So that testing of boundaries with killing is definitely that stage of persecution. Here in Texas, we have a very clear pattern of the process of genocide, the full complete process of genocide with the murder of the Karankawa Indians, which was a small tribe in South Texas in the Galveston, Houston Bay. When Stephen F. Austin, kind of the founding father of Texas, settled Texas in the Austin colony, he actually drafted out a full plan and created the Texas Rangers as the militia who would implement these mass killings. And so the first actions of the Texas Rangers were going out and doing these test, you know, killings of killing a few 50 there, 30 there. And of course, the numbers of the Karankawas weren't to start with in the thousands. They were a very small tribe. But that led eventually to a mass effort to what is considered extermination, where on mass scale, now we have the full intent, we fully go out. And this is finally where the legal definition of genocide kicks in. Not until this point does a genocide convention kick in. All of this before legally does not define yet as genocide according to the convention. And that makes it very difficult if we just look at the genocide convention and that definition to understand the full process sometimes. Not only is all the intent to murder, but to fully remove any existence, and that usually happens culturally and socially in every way. Of course, I have the gates of Auschwitz there for obvious reasons here. the establishment of the death camps. I always like to give the reference of the Tasmanian genocide, again, one of those lost in history genocides. It is actually the most complete genocide we have on record. If you go to Tasmania today, you see a beautiful English countryside. Not only did the British murder every single Tasmanian Aboriginal, but they also killed most of the wildlife. The Tasmanian devil is one of the few ones that remains still in existence, and also all the flora. And it's beautiful green pastures with little sheep hopping around. Trust me, that's not what Tasmania looked like before the British got there. And that is what is considered complete genocide, just a full eradication. And then, of course, we have denial, right? Denial is the stage that usually starts way before. It's the one that runs throughout, but it's also the clear indicator that genocide might still happen and that genocide has occurred when denial starts happening. Usually during this stage, the victim is being blamed for the genocide itself, for causing the violence. Sometimes it's also cover up, as we see with the cover up in the Action program during the Holocaust, in which mass graves were dug up back again and went through these kind of grain treasures to these kind of mills to make sure that there was no bones in the dirt anymore, that it was all filtered away. And so you can see actually a Sonderkommando here during the Holocaust standing next to it. And then, of course, I hope I don't have to explain Armenia too much. So these are the 10 stages. Again, these are the markers in the process that fully complete the process. And they are intended to be an awareness tool, is right, that if you see classification and symbolization happen for hateful purposes, that you can start putting prevention tools in place. And Genocide Watch, somebody pointed out, as an interactive map of where the 10 stages are in the different locations in the world, what stage a nation might be in reference to what, and they will also have recommendations of actions to be taken as well. So if you want to dive into that with groups. Okay, let me go back through some of the questions here. So somebody asked, there's where preparation and organization are very similar. Any good advice on how to clearly differentiate between organization and preparation? Yes, organization is what I call the creation part, or where you create some kind of body that will eventually do the murder. So you create some kind of unit, some kind of body structure. But there might not be a plan yet on how you're going to do the murder. You just create a body to actually implement a murder eventually. And also maybe implement this stage of discrimination or other stages too. Preparation is where you're actually going to draft the plan. This is how we're going to do it. This is how we're going to do the mass murder. Does that make sense between the differences between organizations? So it's creating a body of who will actually do it, and preparation actually implementing it. Native Americans as well, I'm not understanding how that doesn't fit. So Native Americans would not always fit in the definition. And I say not always, because this is why it's important that tribes and nations are recognized as tribes and nations, because then they have a national identity. This is why American Indians are so insistent on being recognized not as American Indians or Native Americans as one lump sum together, but as tribes and nations, because then actually the UN definition can be used, but not as a one unit as Native Americans, because it's the national identity then, strangely enough, that works with that. But in the process of the 10 stages, definitely, right? We can look at these tribes and nations and see, I'm most familiar with tribes and nations in Texas. You know, the Karankawas, there's Austin wrote down in his diary a plan and actually used the word extermination in reference to the Karankawas. So maybe look at primary sources for your local tribes and nations as well. And I think Amanda and Paul and Elena probably can give you better advice on that. If the persecuted group rebel armed counterattacks, is it still considered genocide? Yes, absolutely. It isn't, because there were Tutsis and the Rwanda Patriotic Front came in rescuing Tutsis and fought back and actually got power of the government, that no genocide had happened. It's not because Jews fought back that genocide didn't happen. So yeah, is very key component is that this does not happen. Jim Crow laws, indigenous concentration camp, does America not want to be culpable of genocide? That is a much larger conversation outside of the 10 stages of genocide. But this is why it's also important to not just stick always to that definition of genocide and look at the full process. For example, Jim Crow laws, that is never going to fit the UN definition of genocide. However, you might want to twist this and form it. But if you look at the process of genocide, you can definitely see many of the stages in there. And that is why it's important to recognize at what point did we veer away? What changed in our society that we didn't continue on that process towards genocide? And that is just as important to study. Why do societies deviate away from something rather than always just study the genocides too. So that's important with that as well. Yeah, thank you for sharing those time streams in there too. I just started watching Moon Knight, so I'll have to catch up on that conversation separately. I apologize. Although I am a huge Marvel fan because Stan Lee shaped Marvel's The Avengers after one of the most famous Jewish resistance groups is the United Partisans Organization. That's what the Avengers are shaped after, and the storyline behind it, if you did not know that. So look into that too. And Amanda's sharing some for Oregon references as well. I was waiting for this question to get asked. Do you consider what is going on in the Ukraine genocide? This is a great question, is where you might have noticed that our administration will not call this genocide, because it is actually still being debated out on academic levels and administration levels if this truly fits the definition of genocide, legal definition of genocide, war crimes, mass atrocity. So there's many different crimes within the International Criminal Court. And so we have to be very careful, especially when we are dealing with another world leader like Russia, to be careful what administrations and terms are being used, because if they want to be brought to court, you need to be able to prove it as well. And that intent part and the national identity part are going to be very hard to prove within the Ukraine. For example, if tomorrow there's a peace treaty between the Ukraine and Russia, will the mass atrocities which have or legally happened, will they continue with the intent to fully wipe out? And so that's going to make this very difficult. And I'm sorry, that's not a yes or no answer on me, but more of a, that's going to be in the next few weeks, a very heavy debate.
Charlotte, if I could just pop in for a second, all of these questions about what is and what isn't is not necessarily something that Paul, Charlotte, I, or like really anybody here can answer for you necessarily. These are conversations that are having like among scholars, you know, just a lot of different people. So to ask us to classify a genocide for the government to say, like, that's not going to be a productive conversation. And there's still lots of conversation and debate amongst lots of different people. So I just had wanted to clarify so that we aren't put on the spot. And then you're like, well, this person said this, and, you know, to be safe for us.
Yes, absolutely. So I want to go back to actually giving you some useful information to use right away into your classroom. So what we did is to be able to use that is we created some lessons, and we built the first part of the lesson around the presentation that I just did. And so I shared that graphic organizer and also the poster with it as well. But the second part of the lesson, we for our exhibition created these 10 installations that narrate the 10 stages and then pair them with a historical genocide. Now, this is in the middle of our exhibition, and our exhibition is fairly large. So instead of adding more text panels, we created 10 graphic novels that narrate these 10 stages and these genocides. And you, by the way, have this link in your full set, but I'm just going to show it here, and I hope all of you are able to see it. But here you can read, and it's really easy for your students on a tablet or on a computer, on a flip book, kind of read that. So what you'll see on here is always the definition, and these are the definitions we worked with Dr. Standen. They're the full definitions and a short description of that historical genocide. And we worked with a whole team of historians for each one of these genocides on it. And then it has the graphic novel attached to it. So I'm going to just jump into Guatemala right here. So you can see this is the stage of classification narrated through the Mayan genocide in Guatemala. And many of these are from the viewpoint of a teenager or a child going through that, because that's our main audience coming through the museum. And it narrates through that and through the big, really kind of looking at at each one of these genocides through that. You'll see each graphic novel has kind of its own style that kind of reflects a little bit within the genocide too. By the way, you can zoom in and out. This is the most zoomed out profile with that as well. But what I wanted to show you is that the back of each one of these shows, again, that stage during the Holocaust. So this set of 10 graphic novels has really 11 genocides in it. The 10 genocides narrated in each graphic novel, and then the Holocaust again on the back page too. So you can also use just the back cover if you're using with the younger middle school grades, using just this to teach on the Holocaust as well. With that too. So I'll just reference here the graphic novels. We have Guatemala, Cambodia. Of course, the really focus is going to be on the blue chroma and the eyeglasses. Just kind of flipping through that. And I'm not going to flip through each one of them because you can easily read them online too. Bosnia and the Srebrenica massacre, dehumanization and genocidal terror. That is really going to look at extreme Islamic terror and a really targeting of other Muslims as well. And Elaine, the link for this is in the big document with all of the links that I believe Paula or Amanda shared in the beginning. The Great Leap Forward. For organization, it's really going to look at that formation of the bureaucracy. Rwanda genocide against the Tutsis for polarization. The Holodomor, and this is if you are not very familiar with the Holodomor, or your students don't know anything and you are getting questions about the Ukraine today and what maybe some of that history between Russia and the Ukraine is definitely maybe an easy one to start with the conversation and some of that. I think it's actually out of the whole set, one of the best narrated graphic novels as well. This is going to be a little bit more Texas connection, but you probably find our resources too, is The Murder of the Karankawa Indians by the Austin Colony. And then Tasmania, of course, we picked Tasmania because there is so much documentation on the extensiveness of this genocide. So it's really a unique one to look at as well. And then Armenia and the longest denial with it too. So each one of them, again, are very different in style. With any literature that you use, even though it's a graphic novel, and because of the topic of genocide, we do cover in some of them sexual violence. Unfortunately, that is not something you can separate from genocide. So always read these first before you share them with students. You know your students best. Do not use them in the classroom before you have read them. And you are 100% sure that every single one of your students will be comfortable with that, especially if maybe you have students in your classrooms that might be refugees as well. Make sure it is not triggering further trauma either when you assign these. So be very careful with this and teaching this subject with that, but especially because this is not just talking about it. Now you have whole stories and it gets a lot more personal with these graphic novels. So be very careful with that. Okay, switching back to my PowerPoint. So these can also be purchased in our museum store if you want a hard copy as well. They come in a beautiful little box set as well, but you don't have to spend money on it. You can get them for free on our website too. Also, we have a lesson that comes with the PowerPoint presentation I just did and the graphic novels, and you can request it on this link right here. Well, actually, let me share this really quick, how you can do that. So on that link, let me go back one, that link will take you to this page right here. You will actually request the lesson button and just fill out this form and request the Understanding Genocide lesson right here. It's actually the one that is located right there. So I'm going to show you what is in that lesson right now and then how you can request that. So the lesson starts with using this graphic organizer that I had you fill out. It's kind of a guide as you talk through it. Now, I provided in that lesson, there is either a PowerPoint where you can, just like I did, teach and go through the stages and explain them. Or there's a video where one of our museum educators explains them. So whatever is more comfortable to you, you can use the video or use it yourself, or use the PowerPoint to teach yourself. And I usually also print off the 10 stages during the Holocaust as well as kind of a guide, and then have students fill that out as you give these examples through it. And then you follow that up with a short discussion, really focusing again on those teaching guidelines. How does the process of genocide work? What are the necessary steps, stages in that process of genocide? Why should we know all stages, and why is it important to recognize them? And at which stage does genocide legally occur, right? As that big, you know, the process versus legal genocide. Then there's a second part to the lesson if you have more time, using the graphic novels. And again, it has a separate graphic organizer with it, where they actually read the graphic novel. I usually, if you have all the time in the world and every student reads every graphic novel, great for you, but most of us don't have that time. So you have them pick one. I usually recommend the one that interests them the most. And then they read it first, make them just experience the story first, right? And then have them read it again, but now filling out the graphic organizer. And it's going to look very similar. And of course, I can't show this with my camera on, but it's going to look very similar to this graphic organizer. The only thing is now it's going to be blank. And from the graphic novel, they have to pull all of the 10 stages, because we were really sneaky about it, is kind of laying out those 10 stages for each genocide in each graphic novel. This is much more complex because now they need to be able to recognize those stages within each story. After they're done, again, hold kind of that debrief discussion. What did you learn about the genocide addressed in each graphic novel? Could you recognize, right? Sometimes it's so hard, and that's important to understand, right? In this whole process, it's really hard sometimes to find all of the stages. I just did a presentation on the Rwanda genocide against the Tutsis for our public, and finding images of each one of the stages, it took me a good month to work on that presentation. So sometimes it's really hard to recognize all of that. Which one were easier to recognize, right? How come sometimes it's so hard for us to recognize that we're on a path towards genocide, that this process has been enacted, right? That's what is important. And again, I'm seeing in the chat, several people ask where they can find the graphic novels. In the very beginning, if you scroll all the way up to your chat, it was shared a full document with all of the links that we're sharing tonight, and it has that in there as well. So it has all 3 of these links in there, the lesson on how to request that, the graphic novels, and then the link to the store. And then also these 3 links. These are really key organizations of how you can expand upon just this lesson right here using the graphic novels. One is Genocide Watch, and I see somebody also shared the time streams in there that Genocide Watch has. Genocide does not really create more material for the academic level. We worked with Dr. Stanton trying to create it more for secondary level. So just be aware of that, some of the vocabulary is very high level in that. Then the United States Holocaust Museum, just because they use a very different approach to understanding genocide, using a different model. And then most importantly, when you teach about anything historically, especially if there's testimonies available, use them. So I always like to share eyewitness, but also check in with your local museums and centers as well, what they might have available. I know Amanda and Paul just talked about speakers available. I'm like, this is so key. I cannot stress this out, is so key in teaching this, is them learning firsthand from it. And eyewitness, if you've never used it, just have, they're gathering more. There's some survivors from Cambodia in there, several survivors from Rwanda in there, Bosnia. So there's different activities using testimonies for other genocides as well in there. Any open questions? And I'm going to just stop my share at this point. Any questions? Yep, I see somebody sharing Facing History in there as well. Aw, I hope you get to go soon, Elaine.
This year it might be canceled too because of the war. I mean, it's like, I don't know what's happening.
Just check out virtual programming too, because many of our organizations and centers have amazing virtual programming too. Okay, I want to share our QR code here. If y'all want to hold your phone up, it kind of gives us feedback as well on presentations and information that we share. If you want to do that, and I think Amanda, you're sharing also information with evaluations too for the Oregon folks, I assume.
Yeah, so I put my link in the chat already. I will do it one more time. But yeah, if you are an Oregon educator only, Washington does not have to do this. Idaho doesn't have to do this. Only Oregon educators. If you want PDUs, you must fill out the survey.
And I put my email in the chat too. If you missed anything, if you have other questions, follow-up questions too that you would like to ask me, please let me know. I do recommend for like primary sources for other lessons on this, testimonies. I would recommend go to your local museums and organizations first, because they will probably be able to give you the best support with that too.
And then just one more reminder for everybody, Paul will send out an email with all of the links to everything, including the lesson plan, where to find the graphic novels, all of the stuff for all of our centers. So I know lots of people are asking for it in the chat. There's a lot of links going on in the chat. Just wait for the email that he'll send out tomorrow morning, and it'll just make everything a lot more organized and easier, and everything will be on there in one place for you. So you're not clicking links like crazy right now.
Yeah, When you get that email, if you're looking for the lesson in the graphic novels, it's just going to be 2 links. And I think Paul nicely put them on the very top of the page. So you'll get it really quick, those 2 links. And for everything that I discussed today, everything will be on those 2 links. That's all you'll need. So with that, we'll all be ready and available for you there. It does not give you the complete presentation today, but it will give you in separate buckets most of what I gave you today, the teaching guidelines, the PowerPoint presentation for the lesson, which covers a lot of what we did as well. And it will link you to the graphic novels, everything that you need with that, or videos if you don't feel comfortable yourself lecturing about this, short videos as well, kind of narrating through this too.
Yeah, Charlotte, thank you so much. This is all really incredible. And sorry, I'm just sort of smiling about some of the comments. Yeah, so I promise everybody, yes, you will get all the links again. Everything that you've asked for is in the document that we have shared a few times here. So we will absolutely share it, and we'll even do one better. In talking with Amanda and Elena, Charlotte has been so kind, and so we're getting access to a few extra copies of the graphic novel set. And we are going, our respective centers will raffle off a few copies. So at or about the time you receive the email from me tomorrow, thanking you for attending and blah, 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 sending the links, we will also announce, hopefully as early as then, the winners of our raffle to receive free copies of the 10 Stages of Genocide graphic novel set. And honestly, I bought a set of them myself with my own money, and it was truly, truly phenomenal. I'm a huge graphic novel advocate and proponent, as those of you who know me know well, and they're really thoughtfully well done. And man, do I wish I could be back in the classroom to actually use these with my students. And if anyone wants to talk about how or why, well, Charlotte's lesson is incredible. It really works. It's a graphic novel. Several of you have asked, where is that link? The link is in the document that's going to come to you, I promise. So we will see you all. Charlotte, you've done so great. Honestly, this has been a real scholarly conversation, and there's been so many great questions and comments. And I know on behalf of Charlotte, Amanda, and Elena, and Nancy and Carol, we're so appreciative of you educators, you people, for being here. We know how hard this school year has been. You're almost there though, keep on persevering, and we're here to support you. So please feel free to shoot us any questions. We will help you in every way we can. Charlotte, thank you. This is just the beginning.
Thank you.
Yep, and it's been great to see you.
Thank you everyone for attending. It's wonderful. Thanks,
Awesome.
Charlotte.
Thank you, Nancy. Bye-bye,
you.
everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
There we go.